one of the things that really scares the United States about China is not just what it's doing internally, not just how it's handling its business, right? Because the US doesn't want to see, the collective West, they don't want to see poverty alleviation and stability. All of that doesn't lend itself to getting a few people as rich as possible, as fast as possible. It doesn't lend itself to, how can we divert people's attention onto endless war? They are really concerned about as well, and probably more importantly, is China's global role, China's ability to cooperate with other countries without strings attached, China's ability to lead initiatives like the Belt and Road Initiative, which essentially says to the global south and the global majority, you can trade with us, we will develop your infrastructure, and we will cooperate in win-win exchanges that will make you rich, make you prosper. XYZ country, Pakistan, Venezuela, it doesn't really matter where, because 140 countries are a party to the Belt and Road Initiative, but we will connect you to us and to the rest of the world. We will connect you all together so that trade connectivity is that much more efficient and effective. Because guess what? That helps me as China, that helps me as a manufacturing hub to be able to go by land and by sea to trade in this way. But also, it'll help you because now your underdeveloped economies will have access to certain raw materials, commodities, etc., maybe even access to credit that you didn't have before. So that is what the United States is really concerned about, that because with the economic influence around the world, right? China is the number one trading partner of most countries in the world, right? Whether you're talking about Australia, one of China's chief antagonists, right? So Australia is perhaps even more anti-China than the United States, or whether you're talking about countries like Ukraine, for example. We're talking about countries all around the world. Russia, number one trading partner, the United States, right? Like, number one trading partner is China. So with that power to be able to trade with countries and offer such lucrative and attractive arrangements, right? China will build infrastructure. They have this high technology, they have this manufacturing capacity, and if you want to invest there, it's quite cheap still, right? Despite the rising economic growth that's happening in China, it's still quite cheap to invest, and there are very favorable arrangements you can make with China and with China, the Chinese government, with Chinese banks, and you can make very favorable arrangements to do business. And that's why many U.S. corporations are still there doing business. That's why many European corporations are still there doing business, but on the condition that you don't meddle in the internal affairs of China. And that's been a condition since reform and opening up. Do not meddle in our internal affairs, or there will be consequences. So China now has all of this influence and prestige around the world. It has been able to expand its economic influence, but at the same time, what is often left unsaid is that its political influence, its diplomatic influence is also on the rise. And so we've seen that in the way the Ukraine conflict has played out. We've seen that in its peace proposal, right? Its 12-point plan for peace in Ukraine that has garnered a lot of attention worldwide, including from Zelensky, including from Russia. You had the Xi and Putin meeting back in March of this year. You had China now sending an envoy to all these countries that are party to the conflict, seeking to work on peace. But also, you had some incredible developments, right, in the G20, and incredible developments also happen at the ACAN conference, um, the ASEAN conference, and also now in the Middle East, you have China brokering peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, which has had this massive cascade effect on politics in the Middle East. You have Saudi Arabia and Iran normalizing. You have Turkey and Syria normalizing, Saudi Arabia and Syria normalizing, and now Syria is suddenly back in the Arab League. You have the Yemen war officially coming to an end, as well as the Syrian war coming to an end, because now it's back in the Arab League, and Saudi Arabia and all the Arab countries are now engaging with Syria as the Syrian government as the rightful government of that country for the first time, really since 2011. So, in a word, Chinese diplomacy, by brokering that deal in Beijing, by Iranian officials, Saudi officials sitting down and saying, we're going to, as the two of the most powerful countries, if not the most powerful countries in the Middle East, in the Arab world, in the West Asian region, we are going to put aside our differences and we're going to do so with China. China did that. So, China's diplomacy is a huge reason why the United States is so angry with China. And I want to play you now what Scott Ritter has to say about this. He had a 2-minute topic on this question of diplomacy. All right. And you'll hear his words and take heed of his words, because in this 2-minute topic, does not hold back on why we should be supporting China's diplomatic efforts. Here we go.
Diplomacy. It's the name of a book written by Henry Kissinger, the very famous American diplomat, statesman, somebody who was around back when the United States was the dominant force in the world, where American diplomacy actually meant something. But today, there is no more Nixon goes to China. There isn't even Trump goes to North Korea. What we have is a United States that is floundering in the world, losing its position, declining as a power. A vacuum has been created, a vacuum in a world that's torn asunder by conflict, a world that's begging for diplomacy, and yet America's not there. Who has stepped in to fill the void? China, Russia. China went into the Middle East and helped bring peace between Iran and Saudi Arabia, something that this time last year was unimaginable. And with Russia taking the lead, Saudi Arabia is now making good with Syria. Again, engendering peace in the Middle East, something no American president has either been able to achieve or, frankly speaking, sought to achieve in many, many decades. And now, with the Ukraine conflict, China is once again stepping in, not to, as they said, try to exploit a situation for their own national interests, but to bring about peace, to put hope on the table that there could be a life in Ukraine, in Russia, in Europe following this conflict. But this conflict has to end. This is a situation that screams for diplomacy, a situation that the United States in its past would have been able to step in and try and negotiate some sort of peaceful resolution. But the United States is not only a party to the current conflict in Russia, but it's the leading instigator. And therefore, it's up to China to fix the world's problems, to step into the void, to put diplomacy in action. Thank goodness for China. This has been my 2-minute topic. Remember, knowledge is power.
Okay, I don't know what happened there. There were some issues. I hope that you were able to hear it. Um, there was some skipping. So people said they lost the last 10 seconds. So I can put it back up for the last 10 seconds just so you all get the picture. Okay. Let me do that. All right. Let me do that. So 10 seconds about here.
To fix the world's problems, to step into the void, to put diplomacy in action. Thank goodness for China. This has been my 2-minute topic.
So that's about it. I mean, but what he says is so important. Okay. What he says is so important because what he is saying is that the United States does not have any interest in diplomacy at all, that it's not in a position politically to achieve any kind of diplomatic resolution in all of the wars that it is starting. And yet it is China and Russia too, because I believe that the Saudi and Iran deal opened up the door for Russia to help broker what happened with Syria and Saudi Arabia, and now Turkey and Syria are also getting close to normalization. We're talking about a cascade effect that has been facilitated in large part by China. And these diplomatic moves are part and parcel of a broader problem that the United States is seeing, which is that China is actually attractive. China has the ability to leverage its economic influence to tell other countries, do you want to prosper or do you want to circle the drain, being led like a poodle by the United States? And I believe that both China and Russia have been having serious conversations with other countries like Saudi Arabia and have been very influential in convincing countries like Saudi Arabia to be more strategically independent. If you read Chinese media, especially the Global Times, which is a very important media outlet to read, because the Global Times, as people say, it's the tabloid of the Communist Party of China because it's affiliated with the People's Daily, supposedly. But the Global Times is the most colorful, I would say, English language media outlet that China produces for audiences that, English speaking audiences in the West and elsewhere. And the Global Times regularly talks about whenever diplomatic arenas are being entered, whether it's the Middle East or Europe or anywhere else, always talk about, and this is a government line too. This is how the Chinese government thinks. They always talk about strategic autonomy, strategic independence. They're never going to argue you should stop talking to the United States. You should stop doing business with the United States. You should stop. You should only work with us. But what they will say often and always to European countries like France during Macron's visit, to the European Union overall, when the European Union starts to get a little bit testy and rowdy and wants to kind of mix it up with China, tries to be a bully, Jungle Joseph Borrell, right? Wants to talk big to China. What they'll always say is, do you want to be strategically autonomous and prosper, or do you want to circle the drain and walk like a poodle with the United States? They don't put it in those words, but that is my interpretation of what they're always saying. Do you want strategic autonomy, which is best for you, or do you want to follow the United States, which is not good for you? And so Chinese diplomacy essentially operates as such. It operates as, we can win together. We can do business together. We can economically grow together. Look at what we've done. And that's where the domestic situation is so tied to the foreign policy. It's that, look at what we've done. We were once the poorest country in one of the poorest countries in the world pre 1949, and even much of 1949 to 1959, 60 plus. We're one of the poorest countries in the world all the way up until the 70s. Now we've lifted 850 plus million people out of extreme poverty. We've grown at 10% per year on average in some decades, and now we're still growing at somewhere between 4 to 10% every single year. Now we're leading in all these high-tech fields. We're integrating the world economy. We have these infrastructure initiatives that have the ability to integrate and raise the level of development for everyone. We can lead de-dollarization with you all, the global majority, through mechanisms like BRICS. We got it going on. And so maybe we should all talk about how to have a favorable international situation for us to do this kind of business. And I believe that's why Saudi Arabia, that's why Iran, that's why Syria, that's why Turkey, that's why Russia, that's why a lot of countries look at China and say, well, no, we can definitely make compromises if it means we can follow along a successful path like China's. It'll be different in form, but we can look at that example as something to emulate in our own context so that it's a win-win. We get to remain legitimate. Saudi Arabia's government, for example, gets to go on. It gets to be just as it was. It just doesn't have to be just some lapdog of the United States. And that's the real big issue that the United States has with China's winning diplomacy. That's what I call it. It is winning diplomacy. And the United States, it's not just the United States that has this issue, because the US, right, as Scott Ritter said, they are not prepared nor willing to engage in true diplomacy around the world. They are ratcheting up conflict. You have heard probably over and over and over again from US officials, from Antony Blinken to Jake Sullivan, who was recently pounding his chest about China. You've heard from all of these forces about how this isn't the time for China's peace plan, right? They're all saying that it's not the time for peace, right? China may be proposing peace, but it's not. John Kirby, right? White House spokesperson, defense spokesperson. It's not the time for peace. It's the time to supply Ukraine with weapons and to get ready for a counteroffensive that who knows when it will happen. Doesn't matter. We just want to sell weapons, push weapons, escalate, grind down Ukraine's military, and sanction the world, and just really enforce full spectrum dominance, right? Flood the world with weapons and sanctions and watch it burn. That's what the United States is saying to the world. And China is saying the opposite. China is saying, well, we have weapons, and China definitely deals weapons. It has a military industry, but it's not a top priority. It makes up like a single digit percentage amount of all weapon sales around the world. What China says is, well, okay, if you want some weapons, I guess we can supply those, but we really have the real goods. We have the technology to help you rapidly build major infrastructure development projects, which will jumpstart your industries, i.e., building most of Africa's electric grid, building internet systems, 5G, 4G technology in Bolivia and Saudi Arabia too, right? These are the goods, the real goods, right? The roads, the bridges, the high tech cooperation. That is the real goods. Iraq, right? They have a deal with Iraq to build 1,000 schools in Iraq, many of which were burned to the ground because of the US's bombing campaign during the 2003 to 11 formal invasion. And of course, the bombing continued after that. So China's got the goods. And China thus has the ability to say, let's trade. Let's also wage peace. Let's be at peace with each other. Let's not move toward war. But I want to show you the contrast here. So while China is engaging in this winning diplomacy, I want to show you what Europe is doing. Because Europe is right now engaged in a dangerous game. Not only is Europe destroying itself through its participation in the Ukraine conflict, cutting itself off from Russia, and essentially putting its um, economies, putting the EU's economies in free fall. Europe right now is actually engaging in what is another form of suicide, and that is, quote unquote, they first called it decoupling. Now they don't want to talk about decoupling because Europe is very scared about China, the consequences China will enact if they truly talk about decoupling. So then you had Annalena Baerbock say de-risking, right? And she said that